Funny how some things never change. I remember when neighbors used to wave from their porches, and the biggest argument we ever had was about who baked the best pecan pie for the annual block party. Back then, you could glance at a man fishing by the water and know he wasn't a problem. He was just part of the rhythm of a calm, ordinary day. That's exactly what Oakwood Heights felt like when we first moved in. Quiet, neighborly, the kind of place where time slowed down and people looked after one another. So when I pulled into my driveway and spotted a police cruiser parked beside the community pond, that old familiar sinking feeling returned. Around here, cops didn't just show up. No. In Oakwood Heights, a police visit almost always pointed back to one person, Karen Peaton, our self-appointed queen of the HOA, finding yet another excuse to flex her power. I jogged toward the pond, and before I even saw her, I could hear her. That sharp, shrill voice cutting through the stillness like a siren. There, right on his usual bench, sat Walter Garrison, fishing pole in hand, line cast into the rippling water as if nothing was wrong. At 78, Walter had been here longer than anyone. He'd watched Oakwood Heights transform from farmland to family homes, seen neighbors come and go, yet always kept his routine. Coffee in one hand, tackle box in the other, walking to the pond at sunrise. His weathered hands might have been spotted with age, but they held that rod steady, even as chaos buzzed around him like a mosquito in summer. Behind him stood Karen, arms folded, posture stiff like some wannabe sheriff. She wore her signature, power blazer and slacks, her shiny HOA president badge catching the sun like it was a real star. Her perfectly styled blonde bob bounced with each exaggerated gesture as she pointed and barked orders. The young officer she'd dragged into this looked painfully uncomfortable, shifting from foot to foot as she rattled off her complaints. What none of us knew at that moment was that this little showdown would end up costing the HOA control of over $2 million in waterfront property. But I'll get to that. Let's rewind. Walter had moved into Oakwood Heights back in 1992, when the area was nothing but fields. The pond wasn't some community amenity back then. It was just a quiet fishing hole marking the eastern edge of his 3-acre property. For 30 years, Walter made that walk down the path, thermos in hand, setting up at the water's edge before the rest of the world woke up. Karen, on the other hand, had only been around for 2 years. She'd bought herself a sterile, oversized McMansion at the top of Hillrest Drive. Within 6 months, she was on the HOA board. Within a year, she'd crowned herself president. And from the moment she grabbed the reins, she made it her mission to turn our friendly little neighborhood into what she called a premier residential community. First came the mailbox inspections, then a list of approved house paint colors, 6 different shades of beige, and that was it. After that, she launched into landscaping regulations so rigid, the whole place started to look like the lobby garden of a corporate office. But her latest obsession? The pond. Karen had declared it an HOA-managed feature, and she announced that anyone who wanted to use it had to buy a $50 monthly permit. That Saturday morning, Walter stuck to his routine. Coffee, tackle box, bench. Same as he'd done every Saturday for decades. But less than an hour into his quiet fishing trip, here came Karen, storming down the path in one of her stiff suits, barking orders like she was leading a parade drill. She loudly declared that the pond was now restricted HOA property and that Walter, yes, the man whose home bordered the water, needed HOA approval to cast a line there. Walter. He didn't argue. He just smiled, sipped his coffee, and tossed his line back in. That's when Karen snapped. According to my neighbor Janet, who happened to be walking her golden retriever that morning, Karen actually stood behind Walter, reading passages from the HOA bylaws like she was reciting scripture. When Walter ignored her, she threatened to call the police. And of course, she did. By the time I got to the pond, a small crowd had already gathered. Everyone knew Walter. Everyone also knew Karen's antics, and truthfully, we were all exhausted by them. Phones came out. People started recording. The officer tried to stay calm, asking Walter if he lived in the neighborhood. Walter simply raised a hand and pointed to his house, clear as day, sitting just beyond the trees. The officer turned to Karen, giving her the floor, and she did not hold back. She launched into a fiery speech about property rights and HOA regulations, waving a manila folder in the air like it was holy scripture. Inside, she claimed, was proof. The pond belonged to the HOA, and she even bragged it was valued at over $2 million. But then the officer calmly asked Walter if he had any documents of his own. Walter, ever the patient soul, set down his fishing rod, opened his battered old tackle box, and pulled out a weathered envelope. Inside, a deed. From 1992. The air around us shifted. Conversations hushed. Phones stopped recording mid-scroll. Even Karen froze as the officer carefully unfolded the deed and examined it. Without a word, he stepped aside and made a phone call. Karen, meanwhile, smirked, leaning close to a neighbor to whisper something smug. But when the officer returned, his words wiped that smirk clean off her face. In just a few short sentences, Karen went from confident to confused to absolutely horrified. The county clerk had confirmed the pond and a 50-foot easement around it had never been transferred to the HOA. Thanks to a clerical oversight, during incorporation, the land had remained part of a public trust, with rights tied directly to Walter's deed. Not only was Walter allowed to fish there, he might be the only resident with formal legal access. It hit like a bombshell. The HOA had been charging permit fees and handing out fines for land they didn't even own. Karen tried to argue, but the crowd was already buzzing. Phones lit up with residents scrolling through the HOA website, questioning everything. Could they get refunds? Were any of the rules enforceable? What about the threats and fines Karen had mailed out? Within an hour, 2 county officials arrived. They reviewed Walter's deed, the HOA files, and the incorporation papers. Their verdict was swift. The HOA's claim was invalid. On the spot, one of them, Patricia Holloway, issued a cease and desist order, freezing all HOA activity tied to the pond. Karen was forced, red-faced and trembling, to make a public announcement right there at the water's edge, with Walter still sitting calmly behind her, fishing line in the pond. She stammered out an apology, then announced the new permit rules were revoked. The tension broke instantly. Some neighbors cheered, others ran to grab their poles. The whole thing felt like watching a balloon deflate in slow motion. That night, the HOA board scrambled into an emergency meeting. 3 members quit immediately. The rest voted to hire legal counsel, but the damage was catastrophic. Removing the pond from the HOA's asset list gutted property values and left the association facing over $2 million in losses. Worse, their insurer announced an investigation into Karen for negligence. And then, as if things couldn't get worse for her, more came to light. Walter revealed that he had tried to warn Karen months earlier. After a board meeting, he'd handed her the very same envelope, offering to explain. She'd brushed him off with a sneer and told him to get with the times. What Karen didn't know, what she never bothered to ask, was that Walter's family once owned all the land that became Oakwood Heights. His father had sold it to developers back in the 1980s, but with conditions. The pond would remain accessible, and the Garrison family would retain permanent fishing rights. It was all documented, all on file. When local news stations got hold of the story, the headline exploded. HOA president calls cops on elderly veteran, loses $2 million asset. Yes, Walter was a Vietnam veteran too. Something Karen might have known if she'd ever spoken to him like a neighbor, instead of treating him like a violation notice. But the fallout didn't stop there. As investigators dug deeper, they discovered Karen had been threatening residents with lawsuits over pond access, with zero legal authority. She'd collected over $15,000 in permit fees and even convinced the board to take out a loan, using the pond as collateral. That loan now looked a lot like fraud. The state attorney general opened an inquiry after residents filed complaints. Her real estate license came under review. At the next special meeting, over 200 residents crammed into the clubhouse. The tension was electric. When the financial report came out, not just the $2 million in losses, but nearly $800,000 in projected legal liabilities, audible gasps rippled through the crowd. Karen tried to defend herself, but nobody was buying it. Residents began lining up at the mic, recounting years of her bullying. The $500 fine for a non-compliant mailbox color. The threats she'd sent a disabled veteran over his wheelchair ramp. It all poured out. When the vote finally came to remove her from the board, it passed by a landslide, 212 to 3. The next vote? Whether to hold her personally liable. That one passed too, 198 to 17. The board's attorney explained that she could face civil penalties of over $300,000. Someone in the back shouted that state fines could tack on another $50,000, plus possible jail time. Karen gathered her papers with shaking hands, heels clicking sharply across the clubhouse floor as she fled the room in tears. And Walter, the very next morning, he was back on his bench. Same rod, same pond, same quiet morning routine, like none of the chaos had ever touched him. So if stories like this hit close to home, if you've ever dealt with a power-hungry HOA, a forgotten clause in property law, or a neighbor who just wouldn't quit, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more true neighborhood tales. Because sometimes the biggest drama isn't on TV.